or if you've been to a couple of them, welcome. We will do Q&A at the end of the Zoom via Q&A, the Zoom Q&A functionality. You can submit your questions and then Amy will be taking them at the end of the webinar. Additionally, we are recording right now and we will be posting to YouTube. And if you missed either of the first 2 sessions, those will also be posted to YouTube. They're not up there yet, but they will be up there shortly, hopefully in the next week. So keep an eye out for that. I will also post in the chat the link to the YouTube channel for Women Who Code. And with that, I'm going to give a warm Women Who Code introduction, what we're all about here, and also just kind of a heads up as to what else we're working on with the track this month. So our mission at Women Who Code is to inspire women to excel in technology careers. We truthfully envision a world where women are represented as tech execs, founders, VCs, board members, software engineers. Welcome. We are an inclusive community and we have a strict code of conduct that I'd like to review before we get started this evening. We are dedicated to providing an empowering experience for everyone who participates in our community, regardless of gender, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, ability, physical appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, age, religion, and as we oftentimes like to joke, preferred programming languages. We welcome everyone as a part of our community. So that being said, all of our events are intended to inspire women to excel in those technology careers, including this event this evening. So we do not tolerate any harassment of members of any form. You can go ahead and check out our code of conduct online at womenwhocode.com/code of conduct. So our general target audience for a lot of our webinars are engineers with 2 or more years of experience looking for support and resources to strengthen their influence and level up their careers. And our commitment and our movement to all of you, as the world has changed so much in the last year, we hope that we've been a connecting force or can be a connecting force for you and create that sense of belonging while the world has been asked to isolate. That being said, at the end of 2020, very exciting, we hit 250,000 members. We have 70 networks in 20 countries, and those are more in-person networks. But we also have members digitally in 120 plus different countries. On top of providing different webinars, we put on different events as well as provide conference tickets and scholarships. If you sign up for our weekly newsletter, you can see access to jobs, resources, infinite connections, and some of those scholarship opportunities. So feel free to check that out. So you're here tonight with Women Who Code front end. However, if you are interested in other areas of technology, don't worry, we have 5 other different tracks, including Women Who Code data science, mobile, blockchain, Python, and cloud. Each of these tracks are designed to provide a digital experience for you all with tech talks, workshops, tutorials, technical study, project groups, fireside chats, panels, lightning talks, as well as networking opportunities and access to latest coding resources. So feel free to check that out at womenwhocode.com/digital if you're interested in other areas besides just front end. Additionally, if you're interested in getting involved with us, part of my job is to run our wonderful volunteer team, which are women from all over the world that have supported the track with social media. They've also put on different events, and they've also searched for their networks and brought different speakers to Women Who Code front end. So if you're interested in speaking or volunteering with us in any capacity, you can reach out to me directly at mkcomer@womenwhocode.com. Or if you're interested in volunteering or speaking with any of the specific tracks, you can reach out to the specific tracks listed below. Additionally, we also do partnerships with companies. So if your company is either interested in hiring women and want to be on the job board, or they want to put together a webinar and bring it to our community, feel free to reach out to our sponsorships team. It's a really great way to help recruit and hire women within engineering and also teach women something new. Just to put on your radar, last but not least, some upcoming events here. We have Front End Fridays every single Friday at 2 p.m. in our Slack group. And this upcoming Friday, we'll be focusing on HTML and CSS. And then following Friday, the 12th, we have focusing on front-end frameworks led by our volunteer team. Additionally, we have a speaker February 5th as well at 11 a.m. Building mental health resources in tech and how you can find those resources and why it's important to have those resources in tech. And finally, we also have front-end full disclosure, an AMA session, and Ask Me Anything session. If you've never been to an AMA session, great opportunity for you to network. It's put on by our volunteer front-end team that jumps on and is happy to answer any sort of questions you may have, and a great networking opportunity to meet other members of the community, as well as our incredible volunteer team. And that is tentatively scheduled for February 18th. And AMA stands for Ask Me Anything session. So you literally can show up to the session with any sort of questions you may have to ask other female technologists, some of which focus in front end. I myself am a back end engineer, if you're interested in any of that, and navigating your career, interview prep tips, you name it. We have all different questions that come our way. That being said, without further ado, I would love to introduce you all. Amy, this is our third event. Amy, thank you so much for bringing a multi-series event and spending the last 2 weeks with us. And this is your third week with us. Thank you. And without further ado, welcome Amy. Amy is an accessibility specialist at Digitaloo, and she's here tonight to talk to us about full stack accessibility.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm going to stop my video so I can focus on the slides. I don't have my computer going out too much. So sharing my screen, and hopefully everyone can see. So diving right in to full stack accessibility, and I'm anticipating a lot of questions at the end. What I want to define first is when I say full stack. And I feel like a lot of us, of course, are on that same page of thinking front end, back end, and a lot of things in between. And what I really wanted to focus on mostly when I say full stack is when starting out a project, we are going from concept all the way to launch. And so I just want to touch on each of these ideas in the process. And MK, if you go ahead and run that poll, and I'm just curious to see what part of the process you are a part of. I know a lot of you attending tonight are likely, front-end developers, but what does that mean? Are you part of just development? Are you doing design? Are you doing any planning? Are you part of testing or quality assurance? And so just getting an idea of what you're going to get out of this. And I, of course, expected a lot of development here, but it's really neat to see that some of you are a part of the planning and design, testing and QA. So I'm glad that most of this information will especially help you folks that are attending that are a part of a lot of that project lifecycle. We'll give it one more minute for people to participate. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move along, and I'll be expecting a lot of questions about developments at the end. So like MK said, go ahead and hold on to those or drop them in chat, and we'll get to those at the end. I want to leave ample time for people to ask questions because I know that some things may not seem clear, and I won't necessarily have a lot of code examples or walkthrough, just because I really want to touch on some of these core concepts again and getting you to where you need to go, feeling like you have the vocabulary, feeling like you're more comfortable of asking the types of questions and direction you need to go, and then doing some of that research on your own. Like I was telling MK earlier, we're all coders, and we are accustomed to Googling things and looking things up, going to resources over and over that are trusted. And so that's where I want to get you tonight is bolstering some of your confidence and accessibility, your own knowledge that you're building on, and then going to the kind of trusted resources that even accessibility specialists like to go to, and people who are building things that need some additional accessibility knowledge and assurance. So full stack accessibility, going further, I also want to really drive home the point that accessibility is not a checkpoint at the end of your project. Again, I want to go from the beginning all the way to the end. It needs to be a part of your process, and there are points that you need to think about and questions you need to ask yourself as you go from planning all the way through testing. When you're starting the planning process, the concept of this product that you want to put out, you need to be aware that people with disabilities are a part of your audience. I know we all have preconceived ideas of what a person with a disability looks like, but as you know, a lot of people have preconceived ideas of what an engineer looks like. And so I'd like to just reiterate that there are people who are very visibly disabled and people who are not so visibly disabled. There are people who are disabled who ask for help, and there are people who are disabled that don't ask for help. They know how to navigate their way, but they need that added accessibility so they can have that independence. So your job in planning is to make sure you include people with disabilities as part of your audience, understanding that you will have those people coming to see your site or using your product. And just to remember that people as DEI is becoming this whole buzz acronym, diversity, equity, inclusion. And we as women, of course, understand that Women's Code has their own mention in the code and contact that you're inclusive and you want to accept all kinds of people with abilities, no matter what their ability or race or gender or whatnot. But just remember that accessibility, people with disabilities, is part of that diversity and equity inclusion. So if you're discussing that with your team, just to bring that up again, remember that things to ask yourself: is my product solving a problem for people with disabilities as well? And what are the different needs of my users? So those needs can either be based on, as we've talked in the past, with these accessibility talks, of people might have not hear the same way that you hear, they might not see the same way you see, they might not be able to move the same way that you move, and they might not even be processing information the same way you process information. So these are different points to consider. Moving on, when you're getting your planning going, you're getting your list of requirements out for what this product needs. Don't forget to add in the requirement of what your accessibility guidelines are. What kind of standard are you going by? Is there any laws that you need to follow? Actually writing this down in your requirements will help reinforce accessibility within your project. I mentioned that WCAG 2.1 level AA is often a good start. It's a little above just the bare minimum of what would be expected to remove barriers for people with disabilities, but it's not quite the most optimal and harder to achieve goals. Most of these are very reasonable goals to meet. And I should mention too that 2.1 is the current version, but they are moving towards 2.2. So if you're feeling like digging into stuff, you can even start looking at 2.2 and what kind of additional guidelines that they give. Moving on to design and the design process, which includes mockups, prototypes. This often things happening while you're doing branding, color palette, you're deciding what kind of media, whether audio, video, imagery, is going to go into it and add it to your content, language choices, all of these things you should approach with consideration for people with disabilities. Do the mockups create any barriers? Are you seeing any problems with your color choices that might not be contrasting enough with the different color pairings? Is media, such as video, audio, or even images, are they going to be paired with alternative formats? Are you thinking about that already before it's even put in your product? So a lot of times people who are creating the content, it's good to ask them at this stage what will go with that before it's put up. So that way it's all available to the person who's putting it online. Also for prototypes, is your prototype creating any errors that are someone is unable to perceive a part of the component, or are they able to operate it? Is it understandable of what's going on? And again, this goes back to WCAG of the POUR principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Robust, of course, deals a lot more with code, so that won't really come up yet in prototypes. Development. This is the part that I will be spending the most time on. What I really want to get to is, I can't really emphasize enough of getting back to the basics, our separation of concerns. I know that this could be a whole debate in itself, but I am definitely on team separation of concerns of building structure with meaningful HTML, and then adding that layer of design on. And that's where CSS, the strength of CSS lies. This is when you can lay things out and you can assign the colors. And then the true interaction, that dynamic component, is JavaScript. And a lot of times CSS has become so robust that you can have that bleed over into interaction as well. But the core is that HTML has been that building block for the web since it started. And so if you can really put your effort into that HTML, it's going to save you so much trouble when it comes to accessibility. My friend Nick, he is an accessibility expert, and I just love this tweet that he did way back in April, and I know he's been saying it way before that, but he has to remind people so often. He says that we don't have an accessibility problem. We have a lack of basic HTML knowledge problem. The vast majority of accessibility issues found during audits come down to bad HTML markup. And this is what I found too, doing my own audits, is that it's astounding sometimes that looking at people's code and I think, wow, there's an HTML element for that. Why did they use div or span for that? And they're doing kind of a bunch of hacky things to go with it. And so it almost looks like they put way more effort into building something than what comes built in to HTML. So I just, again, can't emphasize enough, going back to the basics, getting so familiar with HTML. This is front end, and you can just save yourself a lot of trouble and be even better at your craft if you are an expert at HTML. HTML does offer over 100 elements, and this doesn't even include a lot of added attributes that each element has and things that you can do. Just to give you a window into common elements and even some uncommon ones that maybe you don't know about. HTML has landmarks. This came out in HTML5, and of course now HTML is considered a living standard. But landmarks really help people with assistive technologies, in particular screen readers. They can easily navigate from the header to the nav, to the main, to the footer, just by one keystroke. And so allowing people multiple ways to navigate to get through a page, especially if they're not browsing the content like you're familiar with, is huge. It's nice to let them just do something non-linear to get a good sense of what's happening on a page. Headings, there are those 6 heading levels. Lists come in unordered lists and ordered lists. A lot of times when I'm seeing people not using lists, it will visibly look like a list, but for some reason they're not using that UL and those LI elements. And I don't quite understand where that comes from, but a lot of times if something visually looks like a list, it should probably be a list. And the same with headings, rather than relying on CSS to make it look a certain size. You rely heavily on that HTML. And that's what makes your code robust, and it communicates then with the assistive technology, so they get a better sense of how the information is related. Buttons, and I've seen so many times when people want to do custom things, they might do something different than a button. Links, forums have a lot of things going on for them. Tables as well. Tables haven't gone away. They're not inherently bad when you're using them for data and a presentation of related information. They're still very much good and help people understand the information better. Media is not just including image, which is very common, but also the audio element, the video element. I'm not sure how many of you are as familiar with putting those up. Seems like iframes a lot when you're embedding a YouTube video, but there are those own that you don't necessarily have to custom build everything, just depending on what you're going for. The dialogue element, I often don't see that put in practice. It has a few issues with support, I think, with assistive technologies, but it's not bad to use it. And as soon as it receives full support or all assistive tech really gets into using it, I think that's way better to have in place than just a div. Progress, code, there are just so many. And actually on that note, I want to go ahead and just show. So there is the HTML living standard, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that. W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, was keeping up and doing versions at a time, just like CSS has done. But then I think it was 2019 that this working group, WetWig, took over because their argument was that HTML is a living standard. It shouldn't be frozen in time, version by version, that there were things that needed to be updated and discussed and have a community discussing. And so they update this, as you can even see, it's last updated today. And so it's really neat to go through here and you can really dive in to all the different elements that are here. It can probably feel a little bit overwhelming, but I suppose most documentation can at first. But this is a good spot that I would recommend to get more familiar with maybe elements that you don't know exist or finding out if one exists. I will go ahead and drop that in chat just so people can look at that themselves. Also, you're probably more familiar with MDN web docs. This is somewhere where I went to a lot, especially when I was getting more familiar with code. And so, and under the technologies, you have HTML that you can go to. And you can start learning about all the different types that are available and just getting yourself familiar. So we'll drop that in, even though most people here are most likely familiar with it. Okay. Another topic I wanted to introduce today is I feel like some people are becoming more familiar with ARIA, accessible, rich internet applications. It's essentially HTML, and it's meant to fill in the gaps that HTML just hasn't really filled in yet, because we have such an interactive web and all of these web apps basically that have developed. HTML itself, all of those elements have had a hard time keeping up, and it all, of course, ties in with browser implementation and what conversations are being had and what support there is. So ARIA was developed to try to help along with that. And a lot of it comes down to making sure that roles are defined. You need to know, like we have a button element, so that's great. But maybe there's something else that we don't have an element for. And you've checked your HTML, it doesn't exist, and you're going on using something. And so you need to define a certain role, give it an accessible name. So that way the person with the assistive technology, like a screen reader, hits this role, the role is announced button. And what does the button do? What's it for? You announce it with the accessible name, and then the value, whether that value is a state or some sort of property, like this button has been pressed. And so having that in mind, ARIA comes to fill that. Now, ARIA itself does not do anything. I think that's was the confusing part to me at the beginning, as I was trying to get this like ARIA, oh, it's this magical thing that you tag into your code and it makes it accessible. But that's not essentially true, because when you are then custom defining things, you also need to build that interaction that comes with that. And so that's where JavaScript will come in. So whether you're changing out a state or a property, and maybe even the accessible name. And so you need to have a few things working together. So ARIA in itself doesn't solve your problems, but it can make the experience better. So that's why one of the rules for ARIA, it's got kind of a little 5-rule set in its specification, is the first rule is don't use ARIA. Why? Well, that's because sometimes people dive right into using ARIA and they don't really know how it all works together, what you're supposed to be defining, what's the appropriate use of ARIA label versus ARIA labeled by. And they start putting it in there, and then it just makes a mess, a confusing mess for a screen reader, because they're not actually getting the correct information that they need. So it gets confusing. So the recommendation is don't do it unless you really are familiar with what you're doing with it. So spend some time reading the documents, reading the authoring practices that they have, which I should go ahead and drop in the chat for you. Try to get this out of my way. Okay. Go ahead. This is the MDM docs that explain it probably in a little bit less intimidating way. And then the authoring practices page, actually hosted by the W3C, it starts talking about, you know, I want to build this custom button, or I want to build, work with alerts and alert messages. And these give you, well, authoring practices, best practices, how to build that out. So if you've never visited there, I would highly recommend that to help you understand ARIA better. And also, if you really feel like going into the specification itself, I will drop that in chat as well. MK is going to gather all these up and send these out at a later time. So the second rule to ARIA is don't change native semantics if you can. So that's basically saying, hey, I have this heading here, but I'm going to change it to a role button. And I don't know if that's the best example, just because there are some different cases where people are trying to give two semantics to one thing, say like to an accordion or whatnot. And so, but the idea is once you tag on that role attribute, that is going to override the inherent semantics. So if you put button and then role link, or vice versa, you put your anchor element down and you put role button, well, it's going to be announced as this is a button. And so, and in that case, I say, well, why not just use a button? I know they don't come out as pretty out of the box, but that's what CSS is for, right? And so you can change it to the way you look. The browser has their defaults, and we're always changing things all the time. So try to think of if there is an HTML element for it, use it. Don't go swapping around. Otherwise, it can get very confusing and have inadvertent effects. Interactive ARIA controls must be usable with a keyboard. So again, this is driving home the point that ARIA itself doesn't do anything. You have to build that interaction in. So you need to make sure that if you are using a div for some kind of custom element, that the keyboard must be able, somebody must be able to tab essentially to that component, because a div isn't just interactive. You can't just get to it by the keyboard. And so you start putting in things. I mean, even this, you could put in like a tab index, and maybe you don't have to write quite as much JavaScript. 4, don't use role equals presentation or ARIA hidden true on a focusable element. So if an element is supposed to be interactive, what happens if you put role presentation or ARIA hidden true on an active or an element that needs to be interacted with? It means that the screen reader will completely miss it. They will not hear that this thing exists. So it's just like if you were putting an alt attribute on an image and leaving it blank, and the screen reader ignores it. And the same with if you want somebody to interact with something, you don't want to hide it from them at the same time. That's ridiculous. So role presentation and ARIA hidden true have their purposes, but not on focusable elements. Number 5, all interactive elements must have an accessible name. So it's just like when you have a link, which is an interactive element, and it needs to have its text in there that says, where does this link go? Well, any kind of other interactive element needs the same. Buttons need to tell people what it's for. And so be sure, and a lot of times if you're building out with ARIA, you'll use ARIA label, or there might be another way to make sure that the accessible name is there, say as in plain text or something. So you've built with your HTML, you might have sprinkled in some ARIA, you've got the foundation laid, and now you're ready to start making it look, feel, and work better. CSS is a powerful language. The accessibility considerations for CSS would primarily be that you need to consider your choices when you're making things hidden or visible. Maybe when something is hidden and you want it to appear, whether on focus or on hover, just being mindful that both are available because you do have some keyboard only users. If you have something hidden visibly for whatever reason that you're putting it, say either on off screen or you've manipulated it in another way where you want it available to screen readers, like some people are doing with skip to content links or some other things. And so what impact that might have? Why is it completely hidden, but you want it announced to certain people? Well, what about keyboard users? Do they need to see it too? Does it pop up on focus? So just considering of why things are hidden, especially, and how you're handling that are good questions to ask, and the differences between display none and visibility hidden and things like that. So just remember all of your audience and what impact that has. Colors, of course, are probably the most obvious. As we learned last week, that contrast is one of the bigger perennial issues that are happening across the web. And so being mindful of colors for people who are colorblind, for people who have low vision, just making those choices. And again, that goes back to the design phase, but it is amazing sometimes when you start implementing your palette all across different UI components and how it's used, or if it gets put across an image or there's some kind of gradient in the background, the things that can happen. You're like, oh, wait a second. So colors, and then of course, order. And that's the reading order. You want to make sure that matching what you're seeing and what you're hearing, that they go together. And when I say hearing, for a person who is using a screen reader, and not all screen reader users are blind. So keep that in mind, that you want to match what they're seeing with what they're hearing. And again, the grid has made it so possible to put things all over the place that it's good to mind the reading order and how that's going to happen. Same with flex, and we've always had the older things available like position, absolute. So just try to remember those things as you're becoming more aware of accessibility. CSS can be a huge advocate, and it can also be problematic. JavaScript. I feel like this alone could be such a whole nother series in itself that I'm not volunteering for. Okay. But I will quickly touch on some things. I feel like this could be not only controversial, but kind of a mess in itself. And I will try to address questions as they come up at the end. But some things can change depending on the library that you're using, the framework that you're using. And so what I mostly want to touch here on bullet points is that there are some things, no matter what you're using, you should be considerate of when you are using JavaScript to either make your web app or to make just a dynamic part of your web page. So again, the HTML thing, using semantic HTML when possible. So if you're putting HTML in JavaScript, it's good to go ahead and use the right HTML. Managing focus can often be a problem. This especially happens in single page applications. And so you're having them click on one spot and it looks like, you know, visibly they've navigated somewhere, but have you then forced that focus to where they need to be at? And so managing focus, and then, well, and this also goes with modals and things like that. What is happening when they've opened one thing and then they close it, and then where do they end up again? So just thinking from that perspective of, you've taken somewhere, you know, you've implied they need to go one location. Have you taken them to that location? Making everything perceivable. This is touching back again on the name, role, and state. So when you have an interactive thing going on, making sure that it's got those things, or name, role, value in essence. It's accessible to use device independent event handlers. You don't want to write something that is just for mouse users. You want to be inclusive of keyboard users and touchscreen users. Also, again, the dynamics of when you're making things move around, maybe taking something away, you're adding something, maybe you have a feed on your page, of just managing the DOM. So if somebody is navigating around their page, it's not confusing that something appeared suddenly or something disappeared, or you're not making their focus move to another area because something has changed. Just making it very clear where they're at all times and not confusing their experience. Continuing, best practice is assigning one event to one element. Also using, a lot of these are really good practice that make it more inclusive for most people. Using JavaScript as an enhancement. And I know that this to me feels like it's become very problematic when we have these web apps built a lot on the front end. And if JavaScript fails in any way, whether it's been a slow connection, or somebody's got like an ad blocker on that might be finicky, or somebody has it turned off for some reason. I don't know what all those reasons are, but just preparing for that, that then your web app is blank. And so when you're building from HTML to CSS to JavaScript, layering those things on, there's always essentially fallbacks, and the functionality is always there. And so remembering JavaScript as an enhancement rather than the be-all can save a lot of problems and keep people coming to your site and wanting your service, rather than turning people away because I found a link to your site in my ebook and I go there and my Kindle doesn't support the same kind of JavaScript and I come to a page that's blank. So it just opens up your door for more people and more customers to come in. Using JavaScript appropriately, that's just, again, based on the stack that you're using, and using things to spec, and using particular features for what they were built for. And that's part of WCAG of robust, and also having things parsed appropriately. Separating JS as its own layer, of course, we've been talking about that, and then creating fallbacks when possible. And a lot of these all tie together. For quality assurance, things to be asking yourself as you are monitoring throughout the project are automated and manual accessibility checks being run. So what kind of things do you have in place? Are they passing? Does your code validate appropriately? So when you are using things to spec, that it's all working out, and this is going to be the best experience possible, no matter the device, the assistive technology, the user, the browser, the operating system. You are widening that door for more people to use what you've built. For automated tests, these are just a few suggestions that can be done, because I feel like that'd be a question of having things run either during that time or as you are developing and you can go check, or having even site-wide things running after they've been built. I will jump over to a couple of these. In particular, I wanted to just show off AxeLinter on GitHub. This is fairly recent, I think in the past year, and it's free to use, and you can set it up. And actually you can see that I've already purchased it, it's free. It's in the GitHub marketplace. And first, let me copy the link before I forget. And so basically you can set this up to run on any project that you have on GitHub. And when you go to have a pull request, it will then run before any merging is possible, and it'll run its checks. It's based off of Axe, and if any of you are familiar with Axe through DQ, it has a bunch of accessibility checks that are either passing or failing. So it's not 100%. A lot of times automated checkers really only get you about 30% of the way there, but it's better than nothing, and it helps you recognize some problems that you can extinguish right away. So I'd recommend looking that up if you're working off of GitHub a lot. I found it's pretty neat, and I'm hoping to use it more in the future. Another one is the Wave tool, which I showed last time. Just show that, so that you can use an extension either for your Firefox or Chrome, and it can bring up specific areas that are failing and give you errors. Talk about contrast, things to think about, alerts. Are you using ARIA? You can check it out, and it will even point out if it thinks that ARIA is being misused, but it's not perfect. So it's something to check as you are developing. You can go on and just a quick check. Also, AI Inspector is another one. Let me go ahead and refresh that here. And that's essentially the same types of things that it gauges what's going on with your landmarks and your headings, contrast. Again, you'd have to dive a little bit into how that all works and the help for that. But it's another extension that's built. Site Improve and SortSite are both paid services that will scan your entire website. That'll just keep on going however you decide it needs to. It'll be your live site. And so it can give you results on whatever standard that you've selected to go by. And it can bring up errors that maybe you were not, haven't noticed yet while you were building things. And so hopefully through your QA, you've caught a lot of things, but this can help catch things afterwards and even catch other things that pertain to your media, asking, does this have any captions? Does this have an audio description? So those are good things to have throughout while you've got it live. So when you've got tests going on, asking, does this product work for real users with disabilities? so that you're getting towards more of like usability testing, making sure that in principle, you've done your checks, you validated your code, and this seems like it would be okay, but with real users, is it okay? And so trying to get a variety of people to test when possible, even just a small user group, will be eye-opening and useful. When updates are made and pushed live, our checks are still passing. And again, for usability testing, can people with disabilities access all content and components? Or despite your efforts, have they missed anything? Post-launch, I would highly recommend being open to feedback and open to iterative remediation. Putting up an accessibility page on your site with some kind of contact form or contact information to pointedly receive feedback from people with disabilities, and hopefully your form or contact information is accessible, of course. So you can constantly send out a message of we're welcoming, we're trying, please contact us if you have some kind of issue, you want to help and try to make it right. So don't do these things, leave out people with disabilities. You're leaving out at least 25% of your audience. Use an accessibility widget or overlay to make your site accessible. A lot of times people think that, you know, they see a widget or even something like a plugin for WordPress, and they think this is all I need. They can use this to increase text size. They can use this to change the colors. And those things can be nice to have implemented well and depending on what the widget, but it does not solve your accessibility problem. What solves your problem is using HTML appropriately and as robustly as possible, using CSS and JavaScript appropriately, doing your testing, doing those checks. That's what makes it accessible and you caring. You just slapping on a widget or overlay does not work. And then ignoring feedback from people with disabilities. So maybe somebody's reached out to you in some way, even if you didn't put up a contact form, and you just say, yeah, well, they're just an edge case. That doesn't matter. There's really no edge cases. These people have an experience and they're experiencing that your product isn't accessible, and it's good to listen to them because they have offered their time to you to tell you. Because I tell you what, some of my friends with disabilities, they are just too tired and don't have the spoons to confront a business that they want to use, and they just drop it and don't come back. And so if somebody is taking that energy and that time to tell you, I would listen. The one takeaway here, don't wait until the end of your project to ask if this is accessible. It's going to be a burden to you. It's going to be a burden to everyone because they're going to say, oh, but this is going to be extra time and money. If you built it into your process, it's not going to be a burden. Later, I'll provide my slides that has the resources. And to contact me, I'm most active on Twitter at click2carney. And on LinkedIn, sometimes I'm active and try to respond to people at Carney Amy. So I am ready for those questions. We have about 10 minutes.
Great, thank you so much, Amy. So at this time, we'll be taking questions. You can submit them via the Zoom Q&A. So feel free to drop them there or in the chat. Either way, we will see them and get those answered. Just a few things. I will be sending out the link that Amy was posting as well as the slides for tonight to all of the attendees here. So be on the lookout for an email tomorrow from myself with all of those resources for you. That being said, are there any questions at this time?
Too much, too little?
All right, we do have one question in from Adrienne. Just heard an example today that HTML native date picker isn't accessible. Is that true? And is there a good alternative?
Yeah, I guess I'd have to look that up. I know date pickers have been problematic. So that's a very good question. I'm almost wondering, so I'm going to drop one more link in here. So going back to that HTML, there is, and I'm going to share my screen too, actually. So I just dropped in, there's a wonderful site called HTML5 Accessibility, and it kind of monitors how supportive browsers are of a lot of the HTML elements. And I don't know how many elements have been dropped in here because I don't contribute to this project and go here that often. But that really makes me wonder if date picker is in here. You know, of how you can do that. It would be something to check though, because I know a lot of people have been building those themselves, which also becomes problematic. So honestly, I'd have to look that up too and check with other people who've been keeping up on that, because I know that's been a pain point. So I'll have to get back to you.
Gotcha. Sounds good. Another couple of questions are coming in. Adrienne says, no pressure, just curious in response to getting back to her. Another question just came in. I'm looking for an out-of-box free React template. Is there anyone that's already accessibility? Are there anyone that are accessibility compliant that you would recommend?
That's a React template?
Yes, React template.
Yeah, you know, and I don't write a lot in React. I've only done some. So that's another thing I'd have to check on too. And I'm trying to think if I have a good resource here. I know React has done a lot of documentation for accessibility. And so dropping in, this is what React has to say about accessibility. And I don't know if they would promote any templates for sure. I know, so when I've mentioned Marcy Sutton in the past, she's done a lot of work contributing to that group. And so React, I feel like, has gone through a lot of good changes. I'm going to drop her page into that you might be able to follow along with her too, to find the answer to that question, because I'm not a React expert. But I know that the work that has been done in React has pushed them further in accessibility. So I would kind of follow some of those threads and see what you can find.
Great, thanks, Amy. So Jacqueline has another question. What's the best way to include people with disabilities in the development lifecycle, especially if it's hard to secure budget?
Yeah, that's true. I think the first thing, the cheapest thing you can do is definitely starting to find people with disabilities on social media. That's a lot. What I've done is just getting to know people. A lot of people openly share their experiences and stories. And so if you can just understand different experiences better, it's a step closer. It's not the same as actually having someone doing testing, but you can get closer. And then maybe start looking into services of what the cost, and start future budgeting for places that hire people with disabilities to do different testing of their pages. And I think Fable is probably the first one that comes to mind, and I don't know what their costs are, but it might be something to budget for the future. And again, you can also, if people are willing to disclose on your team, sometimes if you have somebody with a disability in your team, they can be helpful on bringing awareness on what challenges that they might have, just depending on what their disability is. I don't think I'm getting to the right page here. Okay, just dropping in Fable's site. Digital product testing powered by people with disability. And that's only one. I know that they offer that service, so it might be good to start planning ahead if you can for budgeting. But yeah, those are the different things that I would recommend in that situation is come in contact on social media with people with disabilities, start learning about their experiences, seeing if there's people available. I wouldn't ask for someone to volunteer to do testing on it that has a disability because I don't feel like that's fair to them. But maybe you can have some other kind of exchange that might be reasonable within your budget to get some insight. And if you can make very pointed testing of areas that you think for sure you're going to struggle with, that if you can make it a very short task-oriented thing, like maybe have them run through 3 things and it takes under an hour, then you can get a lot of insight just into that and allow them some kind of compensation still that's still fair to them and their time.
That's great advice. Thanks, Amy. Another question came in, wondering if you could explain the order of elements you mentioned regarding CSS.
Right, so a lot of that I always think of grid is so interesting that you can place things anywhere. You know, you might have one thing, you know, here, and then number 2 might be assigned over here for whatever reason. So visually, you might see this order, but then the actual order that's being announced to it, you know, so maybe, so the order of the DOM is essentially kind of what the screen reader is reading. So how that's going to read down, you know, like this list item, this one, this one, this one. But you've put this second one down, you've decided to put that way over, you know, somewhere else. And the screen reader reading down is going to get a weird experience compared to the person who sees how the order has been placed. Does that make sense? Most times you're not going to break the order, but I think grid really introduced a quandary as far as it had the power to do so, but then somebody with a screen reader might not be having the same experience.
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you. Perfect. Great. We have 2 more questions that just came in. First, when you mentioned use JS only as an enhancement, what does that mean for React and other JS frameworks?
That's a good question that I can't really answer. As someone that if I could, I would probably do, you know, vanilla JavaScript because you can have that control, and those other apps like React create a whole new experience. So I know one person who's got a friend that she, based on her disability, actually accesses the internet quite a bit from her Kindle because of that e-ink. It takes away any kind of the harsh brightness for her, and it kind of simplifies, and getting things in monochrome is just right. But when you go follow a site and you hit a React site on there, it's just going to be blank because it doesn't receive that kind of JavaScript that way. And so it's really interesting that she would miss out completely. And maybe that feels like an edge case, but with the devices that we have today, I don't think so. So just seeing how things handle JavaScript, and you build all with JavaScript, is every device able to receive that? I don't know. And so I'm definitely an advocate for progressive enhancement, graceful fallbacks. But I won't tell you not to use React, because that's something I think the React community would need to address.
Great, thanks, Amy. And we have one final question, and in response to your answer, good to know, not something I think I've considered before. So thank you for that response. And one final question just came through. What is reasonable compensation for people with disabilities to participate in usability testing?
I would think if you thought of something like a reasonable hourly rate, and I've seen for some usability studies that people might be offered a gift card, like from Amazon or whatever, So if you think of that form of compensation of, maybe your company can give away a few gift cards to people, then it doesn't seem to break the bank, but it's not leaving them like, hey, we paid you $2, and that's not really great here in the US. So I would say minimum wage for somebody giving an hour of their time shouldn't be under $10. And so a lot of times that gift card and somebody giving them a genuine experience is valuable. So does that help a little bit?
I think it does. Cleared up the confusion there for me. Does anybody have any other questions at this time before we wrap up? Great. Well, everyone, please join me in saying a huge thank you to Amy on behalf of Women Who Code. Thank you so much for being here and spending the last 3 evenings with us. It's been great to level up our accessibility and learn how we can actually apply accessibility to our development processes. So thank you, Amy, so much for being part of this community and sharing your work with our community as well. And for everyone attending, be on the lookout tomorrow. I'll send out the deck on top of some of the URLs that Amy was posting to the chat. And everyone have a great evening. And thank you again, Amy, so much for your time.
Yeah, have a good night.